My name is Daniel, and this story is about the moment I realized that in my own family, the word family had rules I was never told about. It's about my parents' wedding anniversary, the one celebration I was deliberately excluded from, and the quiet decision I made that changed how everyone saw me afterward. I'm telling this story not for sympathy, but because sometimes the most painful betrayals come wrapped in calm voices and polite excuses, and because silence, when used correctly, can be louder than confrontation. My parents were approaching their 35th wedding anniversary, a milestone everyone else seemed excited about long before I was even aware plans were being made. 35 years together sounded like something worth celebrating properly, and from what I could tell through scattered conversations and social media hints, that was exactly what was happening. Friends were flying in, extended relatives were rearranging schedules, and my sister Claire had proudly taken charge of organizing the entire event. Claire always liked being in charge. She liked deciding who belonged where, who spoke when, and who mattered in moments that were meant to look perfect from the outside. Claire is 2 years younger than me, but growing up, age never mattered much between us. What mattered was attention. She demanded it, and the family learned to orbit around her needs without questioning it. If she wanted something changed, it was changed. If she felt slighted, everyone scrambled to fix it. I learned early that resisting only made things worse, so I became the quiet one, the reliable one, the one who didn't need much. At least, that's what they told themselves. Over time, that role hardened into expectation, and expectation quietly turned into invisibility. By the time we were adults, our positions were well established. Claire handled appearances. She planned dinners, organized holidays, and made sure everyone knew she was the one holding things together. I handled responsibility. When paperwork needed sorting, when bills needed covering, when something complicated had to be done correctly and without drama, my parents came to me. I didn't mind at the time. I told myself that contribution didn't need applause, that being useful was enough. What I didn't realize was how easily usefulness could be taken for granted. The first sign that something was off came when I heard about the anniversary venue from someone who wasn't even in our immediate family. A cousin casually mentioned how beautiful the estate looked and how impressive the planning seemed. I smiled, nodded, and said I was glad my parents were being celebrated. Inside, though, something felt strange. I hadn't received an invitation. No message, no call, not even a vague mention. I assumed it was a mistake, the kind that happens when one person controls everything and forgets a detail. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, so I waited. Days passed. Then weeks. Still nothing. That's when I decided to call Claire directly. I didn't rehearse what I was going to say. I didn't think I needed to. After all, I was her brother. This wasn't a negotiation. It was just a conversation. She answered on the second ring, and before I could finish greeting her, her tone sharpened, like she already knew why I was calling and didn't appreciate it. She told me not to make things awkward, which immediately told me more than she probably intended. Awkward meant inconvenient. Awkward meant questioning her authority. I asked her what she meant, keeping my voice calm. There was a pause, not confused, not uncertain, but deliberate. Then she said it, plainly and without hesitation. It's only for family. No explanation followed. No softening of the words. Just that sentence, delivered like a fact that didn't require justification. For a moment, I thought she must be joking. I laughed lightly and reminded her that I was family. She sighed, the kind of sigh people use when they think someone else is being difficult, and told me I knew what she meant. She said it was a small, intimate gathering, and that Mom and Dad wanted it that way. I asked her if they had said that themselves. There was another pause, longer this time. When she answered, she didn't say yes. She said they trusted her to handle it. That was when I understood that this decision hadn't come from my parents at all. or at least not directly. It had come from Claire, from her idea of what the family should look like and who fit into that picture. I didn't argue. I didn't accuse her. I asked one question, the only one that mattered. Asked if she had decided I didn't belong. She told me not to twist her words, but she never corrected them either. When the call ended, I sat in silence longer than I expected to. I wasn't angry in the way people imagine anger. There was no urge to shout or demand answers. What I felt instead was clarity. A sharp, uncomfortable awareness of how easily I had been erased from something that should have been unquestionable. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't an oversight. It was a choice, and it had been made without a second thought. Looking back, the signs had always been there. Growing up, Claire's milestones were celebrated loudly, while mine were acknowledged quietly, if at all. Her mistakes were explained away, while mine were remembered. When she spoke, people listened. When I spoke, conversations moved on. I learned to contribute without expecting recognition, to support without standing in the spotlight. Over time, I convinced myself that this was maturity, that I was choosing peace. What I didn't realize was that peace, when one-sided, becomes permission. The anniversary hurt more than I wanted to admit, not because I needed validation, but because it stripped away the last illusion. This time, I wasn't even allowed to be present. I wasn't useful behind the scenes. I wasn't helpful quietly. I was simply excluded. A week later, the invitation appeared, not in my inbox, not in my messages, but in a family group chat. Claire posted a photo of the venue, beautifully lit, elegant, and carefully chosen. Her caption talked about celebrating those who truly mattered. People reacted with hearts and compliments. I said nothing. What no one in that group knew, and what Claire especially didn't know, was that the venue she proudly displayed wasn't unfamiliar to me. I had been there months earlier, long before she took control of the plans. Not as a guest, but as the person who had reviewed contracts, approved details, and quietly made sure everything my parents wanted was possible. When they first mentioned wanting to do something meaningful for their anniversary, they had come to me, not because I demanded it, but because they trusted me to handle things without turning it into a performance. I never told Claire. I never asked for credit. I never felt the need to, but when she told me it was only for family, something inside me shifted. For the first time, I stopped stepping back. I stopped filling gaps silently. I didn't confront her. I didn't correct the narrative. I simply let it stand. I opened my calendar, noted the date, and decided that this time, I would let the truth reveal itself without my interference. Sometimes, the most powerful response to exclusion isn't anger. It's patience. And that night was already moving toward an outcome Claire hadn't planned for. Looking back, the anniversary exclusion didn't come out of nowhere. It was simply the clearest example of a pattern that had been forming for years, quietly and consistently, until it felt normal to everyone except me. Families like to believe they are fair by default, that love is evenly distributed unless something dramatic happens to disrupt it. In my case, nothing dramatic ever happened, which is why the imbalance went unnoticed. Or maybe it was noticed and simply accepted as convenient. Growing up, Claire and I were raised in the same house, by the same parents, under the same roof, but our experiences could not have been more different. Claire was expressive, emotional, and quick to react. I was observant, reserved, and slow to speak. That difference alone shaped how we were treated. When Claire cried, it was a crisis. When I went quiet, it was seen as independence. When she needed reassurance, she received it immediately. When I needed support, I was praised for handling things on my own. At the time, I thought that meant my parents trusted me more. It took years to understand that trust, when unbalanced, can feel a lot like neglect. School events were the first place I noticed it clearly. Claire's performances were attended religiously. Cameras came out, schedules were rearranged, applause was loud and enthusiastic. When it was my turn, there were excuses. Work ran late. Traffic was bad. Someone forgot the date. My parents always apologized afterward, and I always told them it was fine. Over time, they stopped apologizing because I stopped reacting. Silence, again, became permission. As teenagers, the contrast sharpened. Claire's mistakes were treated like learning experiences. Mine were treated like disappointments. If she missed a deadline, someone intervened. If I struggled, I was reminded to be more responsible. I learned to anticipate problems before they happened, to fix things quietly, to make myself useful rather than visible. It earned me a certain reputation within the family: dependable, low maintenance, uncomplicated. What it didn't earn me was consideration. When we became adults, the dynamic didn't change, it just evolved. Claire moved into roles that came with attention. She worked jobs that were social, visible, and easy to explain at dinner parties. I moved into work that was complex, behind the scenes, and rarely discussed. When relatives asked what I did, conversations often drifted elsewhere before I finished answering. When Claire spoke, people listened. When I spoke, people nodded politely and waited for her to continue.
No one was cruel about it.
That was the problem. Cruelty is obvious. Neglect hides behind normalcy. My parents leaned on me more as they got older. They didn't even realize they were doing it. If there was a form they didn't understand, they brought it to me. If a financial decision needed careful thought, they asked for my input. If something needed to be handled discreetly, they trusted me. I helped because I wanted to, not because I expected anything in return. I told myself that love wasn't transactional. I believed that being there mattered more than being seen. Claire, on the other hand, handled presentation. She decided how family events looked from the outside. Holidays, birthdays, anniversaries all passed through her filter. She chose the restaurants, the guest lists, the tone. Over time, her authority went unquestioned, partly because it was easier that way. Challenging her meant conflict, and everyone preferred peace. I preferred it too, or at least I thought I did. There were moments, though, when the imbalance became impossible to ignore. Like the time my parents hosted a large holiday dinner, and Claire publicly took credit for organizing it, thanking everyone for their help, while conveniently forgetting to mention that I had paid for half of it. Or the time a relative praised Claire for holding the family together, while I stood nearby, having spent weeks resolving an issue no one else wanted to touch. Each time, I swallowed the discomfort and moved on. I told myself recognition didn't matter. I told myself I didn't need it. But the truth is, everyone needs to feel like they belong. The deeper problem wasn't that Claire was favored. It was that my absence slowly became acceptable. Decisions were made without consulting me. Plans were finalized without my input. Eventually, events were scheduled without even informing me. I didn't protest, and that made it easier for everyone to assume I didn't care. The reality was more complicated. I cared deeply. I just didn't know how to express it without becoming the problem. That's why the anniversary hit differently. It wasn't just another slight. It was a declaration. A clear message that when appearances mattered most, I wasn't considered essential. The phrase, "only for family," echoed in me had long after the call ended, not because it was shocking, but because it confirmed something I had suspected for years. In Claire's version of the family, I was optional. What hurt most was that my parents had no idea. They trusted Claire completely, assuming she would include everyone who mattered. They didn't question her choices, because questioning her meant tension, and tension was something they avoided at all costs. I realized then that my role as the quiet problem solver had created a blind spot. By making things easy for everyone, I had made myself invisible. There was a time when I might have confronted them, might have explained how excluded I felt, might have demanded clarity. But experience had taught me how those conversations usually ended. Apologies without change, promises without follow-through, and a subtle implication that I was being too sensitive. I didn't want another discussion that left me feeling smaller than before. Instead, I watched. I watched as Claire enjoyed the attention, as she shared updates and photos, as people praised her for her dedication. I watched as my parents spoke excitedly about the upcoming celebration, unaware that I wouldn't be there. Every mention of the anniversary felt like a quiet test of my restraint. Each time I passed, not because it didn't hurt, but because I was beginning to understand something important. Power doesn't always come from confrontation. Sometimes it comes from patience. I thought about all the years I had stepped aside, all the moments I had chosen silence over conflict. I realized that for the first time, silence could serve a different purpose. Instead of protecting others from discomfort, it could allow the truth to surface on its own. Claire was confident. She believed she controlled the narrative. She believed the night would unfold exactly as she planned it. And that confidence was built on one assumption, that I would continue to stay quiet. She didn't know that my quiet had limits. As the anniversary date drew closer, something inside me shifted from hurt to resolve. I wasn't angry. I wasn't plotting revenge in the dramatic sense. I simply decided that I would no longer correct misconceptions that benefited others at my expense. I would no longer fill in the gaps without acknowledgement. I would let people see exactly how things worked when I stepped back completely. For the first time in a long while, I felt calm, because I knew something Claire didn't. And soon enough, so would everyone else. In the days following that realization, I didn't feel the urge to confront anyone. There were no late-night messages typed and deleted, no dramatic phone calls, no speeches prepared in my head. Instead, there was a strange calm that settled over me, the kind that comes when you finally understand where you stand. Once you stop expecting fairness from people who have never offered it, clarity becomes easier to live with. I wasn't planning a scene. I wasn't planning revenge. I was simply done correcting a version of reality that no one wanted to question. I went back to my routines. Work, errands, the quiet structure of a life that had always existed slightly outside the family spotlight. To anyone watching, nothing had changed. That was important. Claire thrived on reactions. She fed off resistance, on the energy that came from being challenged. By giving her none, I was already doing something she didn't know how to handle. Silence, when chosen deliberately, unsettles people who rely on control. What Claire didn't know was that the anniversary plans were already intertwined with me in ways she hadn't bothered to uncover. Months earlier, when my parents first mentioned wanting to celebrate their milestone, they hadn't wanted anything extravagant. They talked about memories, about wanting a night that felt meaningful rather than showy. They trusted me to explore options because I was careful, because I listened, because I didn't turn every decision into a performance. I had taken that responsibility seriously. I had visited several venues before settling on the estate Claire later claimed as her brilliant discovery. It was quiet, elegant, and understated, the kind of place that felt special without trying too hard. I spoke directly with the manager, reviewed contracts, and ensured everything could be handled discreetly. At the time, there was no reason to announce any of this. I assumed we were working toward the same goal. I assumed inclusion was a given. When Claire took over, she didn't ask questions. She didn't review past discussions. She simply stepped into the role and rewrote the narrative as if nothing had existed before her involvement. I let it happen, not because I was weak, but because I didn't believe credit mattered. The celebration was for my parents, not for me. At least, that's what I told myself. But after the phone call, after hearing myself excluded so casually, I realized something important. Credit might not matter, but truth does. And truth has a way of emerging when people become too comfortable with their assumptions. I reviewed the agreements I had signed months earlier, not out of panic, but out of curiosity. Everything was in order. The venue knew me. The manager remembered our conversations clearly. My name was on the approvals, tied quietly to arrangements Claire was now presenting as her own. I didn't need to change anything. I didn't need to intervene. I simply needed to let events unfold as they already were. For the first time, I stopped making things easier for everyone else. Normally, if there was a question, I answered it. If there was confusion, I clarified it. If something needed smoothing over, I did it without being asked. This time, I didn't. When messages circulated in the group chat about last-minute details, I stayed silent. When Claire confidently reassured everyone that everything was under control, I let her. Every assumption she made rested on the belief that nothing existed beyond her awareness. Meanwhile, I focused on one thing: my parents. I spent time with them quietly, outside the chaos of planning. We talked about their early years together, about sacrifices they had made, about moments they rarely shared with anyone else. They were excited about the anniversary, grateful for what they believed Claire was doing, and completely unaware of the tension beneath the surface. I didn't correct them. I didn't want to taint their anticipation with conflict. Whatever happened would happen without burdening them with explanations. There was a moment a few days before the event when I considered stepping in. I imagined calling Claire, telling her exactly how things stood, forcing a conversation that had been avoided for years. But I knew how that would end. Defensiveness, denial, justifications. And in the end, nothing would truly change. She would still see herself as the authority, still believe her version of events was the only one that mattered. Instead, I chose restraint. Not passive restraint, but deliberate restraint. I informed the venue manager of one thing only, that I would not be attending as a guest. I didn't give reasons. I didn't ask for changes. I simply said that I trusted them to proceed as planned. There was a pause on the other end of the line, the kind that comes when someone senses there's more beneath the surface. The manager told me everything was ready and assured me that the evening would go smoothly. I thanked him and ended the call. In the days leading up to the anniversary, Claire's confidence grew. Her messages became more self-assured, her updates more performative. She spoke as if the night was a testament to her dedication, her effort, her role as the responsible daughter. People praised her openly. I watched without reacting, not because it didn't sting, but because I understood something she didn't. Confidence built on incomplete information is fragile. The night before the anniversary, I sat alone and thought about what might happen. Not in terms of confrontation, but in terms of consequences. I wasn't sure how the truth would surface or who would reveal it. I only knew that I had done nothing dishonest, nothing cruel, nothing impulsive. I had simply stopped protecting a narrative that excluded me. That realization brought peace. For years, I had tried to balance family harmony with personal dignity, often sacrificing the latter for the former. This time, I chose differently. I didn't need an apology. I didn't need a public acknowledgement. I just needed to stop participating in my own erasure. On the morning of the anniversary, I woke up with an unexpected sense of calm. No nerves, no anger, just acceptance. The evening would unfold without my presence, exactly as Claire intended. Or so she believed. I went about my day as usual, answering emails, completing tasks, maintaining the normalcy that had always shielded deeper truths from view. As the hour approached, I checked my phone one last time. Messages filled the group chat, excitement peaking, final touches being celebrated.
I didn't respond.
I closed the app and placed the phone face down on the table, somewhere, in a beautifully lit estate. People were gathering. Glasses were being filled. Speeches were being prepared. And my absence, so carefully engineered, was about to become impossible to ignore. Not because I demanded attention, but because, for once, I had stopped giving it away. The anniversary evening arrived quietly for me, without ceremony or anticipation. While everyone else was dressing up, rehearsing speeches, and sharing last-minute updates, I moved through the hours as if it were any other day. That wasn't indifference. It was control. For once, I wasn't emotionally ahead of the moment or behind it. I was exactly where I needed to be, watching events unfold from a distance I had chosen for myself. At the estate, the night was unfolding exactly as Claire had planned. Guests arrived to soft lighting and carefully arranged tables. Music played at just the right volume, elegant but unobtrusive. Everything looked perfect, which mattered deeply to her. Claire moved through the crowd confidently, greeting people, accepting compliments, soaking in the admiration she believed she had earned. To anyone watching, she looked like the devoted daughter who had pulled off something remarkable. No one questioned it. Why would they? Appearances rarely invite scrutiny when they are this polished. My parents arrived shortly after, visibly touched by the turnout. They smiled more than I had seen them smile in years, moved by familiar faces and warm words. They thanked Claire repeatedly, unaware of the quiet absence that hung in the background. At first, they didn't notice I wasn't there. With so many people around, it was easy to assume I was simply running late or caught up in conversation somewhere else. That assumption would not last. As the evening progressed, subtle questions began to surface. An aunt asked Claire where I was. A family friend glanced around the room and frowned slightly. Each time, Claire brushed it off with ease, saying I couldn't make it or that I had other commitments. She said it with confidence, the kind that discourages follow-up questions. People nodded and moved on. Still, something shifted. Absence becomes noticeable when it lingers too long.
Dinner was served.
Toasts were prepared. The atmosphere was warm, celebratory, exactly as my parents had hoped. Then came the moment Claire had been waiting for. She stood, tapped her glass, and the room quieted. This was her stage. She spoke about dedication, about family, about how much effort had gone into making the night special. Her words were smooth, practiced, and well-received. Applause followed, exactly on cue. That was when the estate manager stepped forward. It wasn't dramatic. There was no interruption, no raised voice. He simply leaned toward Claire and said something quietly. I would later learn that it was a reminder, a detail she hadn't known she needed to account for. Her expression changed briefly, just enough to be noticed by those closest to her. Confusion flickered across her face before she forced a smile and nodded. The manager took the microphone. He thanked everyone for coming and spoke briefly about the significance of celebrating such a long marriage. Then, almost casually, he mentioned that before the evening continued, he needed to acknowledge something important. He spoke about the planning process, about early conversations, about how the event had come together long before the final arrangements were visible. His tone was professional, calm, and factual. He said my name, Daniel. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But it cut through the room with startling clarity. He explained that the initial arrangements, approvals, and commitments for the venue had been handled months earlier, and that it was important to recognize the person who had ensured the evening was possible. He thanked me for my role and expressed regret that I couldn't be present to hear it myself. The silence that followed was not polite. It was stunned. My parents looked at each other, confusion quickly turning into realization. Guests exchanged glances. A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Claire stood frozen, her confident posture faltering for the first time that night. This was not part of her script. She hadn't planned for this. She hadn't even known it existed. Someone asked where I was. This time, no one answered immediately. The manager continued, unaware of the tension he had unleashed. He spoke about how often contributions happen quietly, without recognition, and how important it was to acknowledge them when possible. His words were not accusatory. They didn't need to be. The truth carried enough weight on its own. My parents stood up. They didn't shout. They didn't create a scene. But their disappointment was visible, and that was somehow worse. They asked Claire why they hadn't known any of this. Why I wasn't there. Why no one had mentioned my involvement. Claire tried to respond, but her earlier confidence had evaporated. Explanations stumbled over each other, none of them convincing. In that moment, the narrative Claire had built collapsed under its own omissions. I wasn't there to watch it happen, but I didn't need to be. The outcome didn't depend on my presence. It depended on facts, and facts have a way of asserting themselves when left alone. My parents excused themselves briefly, stepping away from the crowd. Conversations resumed in hushed tones, curiosity replacing celebration. The night continued, but the atmosphere had changed irreversibly. Later, I would learn that my parents left early. Not in anger, but in quiet reflection. I spent that evening at home, away from the lights and the speeches, sitting with a sense of calm I hadn't felt in years. My phone buzzed several times. Messages appeared and disappeared. Calls went unanswered. I didn't ignore them out of spite. I simply wasn't ready to speak yet. Some truths need space to settle before they can be discussed honestly. The night ended without confrontation, without shouting, without the kind of spectacle people expect in moments like these. And that was the point. There was no victory speech. No dramatic exit. Just the slow, unavoidable realization that something fundamental had been overlooked. Claire had believed control meant ownership. She had believed visibility meant authority. She had believed silence meant compliance. That night proved otherwise. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is step back and let reality speak for itself. And it had. The morning after the anniversary felt heavier than I expected, not with regret, but with a strange sense of finality. Something had shifted, and there was no undoing it. I woke up to missed calls and messages that I didn't open right away. Not because I wanted to punish anyone, but because I needed to be sure of my own thoughts before engaging with theirs. When you spend years being overlooked, you learn the value of responding slowly, deliberately, and on your own terms. It was my mother who finally reached me, her message simple and uncharacteristically direct. She asked where I was and why I hadn't come. There was no accusation in her words, just confusion and hurt. I called her back a few minutes later. Her voice sounded tired, not angry, and that made the conversation easier and harder at the same time. She told me they hadn't known I wasn't invited, that they assumed I had chosen not to attend. Hearing that confirmed what I had already suspected. The exclusion hadn't started with them, but it had reached them all the same. I didn't interrupt her. I let her speak, let her process the night in her own way. When she finished, I explained calmly, without emotion, what had happened. I told her about the phone call with Claire, about the words, "only for family," about my decision not to argue. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I simply described events as they had unfolded. Silence filled the space between us when I finished, long and uncomfortable. Then she apologized, quietly and sincerely. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't erase years of imbalance. But it mattered. My father joined the call later. He didn't say much at first. He listened. When he did speak, his disappointment was clear, not directed at me, but at the situation they had allowed to develop. He admitted they had relied too heavily on Claire to manage family matters, assuming that trust equaled fairness. He said they hadn't realized how often I had been left out because I never complained. That was the closest thing to acknowledgement I had ever received, and it landed heavier than praise ever could have. Claire called that afternoon. I let it go to voicemail. Not out of spite, but because I wasn't ready to hear defensiveness disguised as explanation. When she finally sent a message, it wasn't an apology. It was a justification. She said she hadn't meant it the way it sounded. She said she was under pressure. She said she assumed I wouldn't care. That assumption, more than anything else, explained everything. I didn't reply immediately. Some conversations lose their power when you delay them long enough. Days passed, and the noise settled. The anniversary became something people talked about in quieter tones, less for the celebration and more for the unexpected tension that followed. Claire's role as the unquestioned organizer subtly changed. People began asking more questions, seeking confirmation rather than assuming. Authority, once challenged, rarely returns to its original form. Eventually, I met my parents in person. There were no speeches, no confrontations. We talked about ordinary things at first, easing into the conversation we had avoided for years. When the topic finally turned to the anniversary, I told them something I had never said before. I told them that I didn't need to be the center of attention. I didn't need praise. I just needed to feel included. My mother cried quietly. My father nodded, absorbing words he should have heard a long time ago. They didn't promise to change everything overnight. Real change rarely comes with grand declarations. But they did something more important. They started listening. Claire and I spoke later, much later, when emotions had cooled. The conversation wasn't satisfying in the way people imagine resolution should be. There was no dramatic apology, no sudden transformation. There was discomfort, defensiveness, and eventually, reluctant acknowledgement that she had overstepped. I didn't push her further. My goal was never to win an argument. It was to stop disappearing. What surprised me most was how light I felt afterward. For years, I had carried the quiet burden of being the reliable one, the invisible one, believing that endurance was the same as strength. Letting go of that belief freed me in ways I hadn't expected. I stopped volunteering for things that went unnoticed. I stopped filling gaps without acknowledgement. I didn't withdraw from my family, but I changed how I showed up. Respect followed. Not immediately, and not perfectly, but enough to matter. The anniversary night didn't end with applause for me, and it didn't need to. Its impact unfolded slowly, in conversations, in realizations, in subtle shifts in behavior. That kind of change lasts longer than any public confrontation ever could. I learned that silence isn't weakness when it's chosen intentionally. It's clarity. If there's one thing this experience taught me, it's that belonging isn't something you beg for. It's something you define through boundaries and self-respect. Family doesn't get to decide your worth based on convenience or control. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is step back and allow people to see what your absence truly means. I wasn't invited to my parents' anniversary. I didn't force my way in. I didn't demand explanations. I simply let the truth surface on its own. And when it did, it changed how everyone saw me, including myself. That was enough.